Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I want to start by welcoming the reporters on this call. We're glad you're here as we look back at the first 100 days of the Trump administration and focus on the strong, creative, and people-first ways that state leaders are taking action right now. My name is Emmy Crawford, and I'm the Senior Director of Communications at the State Innovation Exchange, or SiX. SiX is a national organization that works at the intersection of government and social movements. Our goal is to make sure that progressive policies don't just get passed, but that they actually make a difference in people's lives. We believe the real power comes from how decisions are made, who gets to speak up, and how laws are carried out. We're excited today to be joined by four amazing leaders who are using this approach in their own states and represent what states are experiencing on the East Coast, Midwest, and West Coast. First, you'll hear from SiX's Senior Vice President of Programs, Georgia State Senator Kim Jackson, who will give us an overview of what's happening in the states and how lawmakers and communities are working together in this moment. Next, we'll hear from Iowa Representative Megan Srinivas, who is organizing with her colleagues and Iowans to protect the health of working families over corporate profits. Then we'll hear from Washington Senator Noel Frame, who is working to pass a wealth tax and make sure the richest pay their fair share, while leading in close partnership with community. And finally, we'll hear from Wisconsin Representative Sylvia Ortiz-Velez, who will weigh in on the implication of Judge Hannah Dugan's arrest on the state of Wisconsin and how she has been fighting with her community to safeguard and protect immigrant rights. These leaders show us what's possible when we lead in a new way, by listening, by sharing power, and by working with people and not just for them. After we hear from each speaker, we'll open up to questions. You can ask questions in the chat at any point, or use the raise hand function during the Q&A portion and come off mute to ask your question. I'll be sending around a recording of today's call later. I'll also note that this is a 501c3 press call. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator Kim Jackson to get us started.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Emmy, for your introduction. My name is Kim Jackson, and my role as both a Georgia State Senator and the Senior Vice President of Programs at SiX directly lends itself to an eye-opening insight into the relationship between state lawmakers and impacted communities. SiX has spent the last 10 years building partnerships with thousands of state legislators with a focus on empowering legislators to place their communities front and center when crafting and fighting for progressive policies. As we have seen firsthand, the most effective way to create tangible results for those directly impacted by policymaking is to champion and strengthen people-focused collaborative governments, a collaboration that brings legislators and communities together to make government more participatory, accountable, and effective. As we've watched the current authoritarian administration over the past 100 days systematically attempt to destroy the very institutions that protect our democratic freedoms and our shared humanities, we know now more than ever that states must rise up collectively to fight back against the chaos and disruption exploding around our country. From the devastating effects of DOGE dismantling federal agencies, to the life-threatening restrictions on reproductive rights and EMTALA protections, we are witnessing a devastating assault on our citizens from within our very own government. The attacks on our minority communities through crackdowns on the LGBTQ+ and the immigrant populations, and the erasure of DEI initiatives, they're not just coming from the White House. State legislators are copying these harmful policies and working to enforce the Trump administration's regressive policies and an ill-advised attempt to gain favor with a billionaire oligarch and dictators. Our democracy is under clear attack, and our standing on the international stage is at stake, as evidenced by this administration's flippant imposition of tariffs that are destroying our trade relationships arbitrary and unlawful detention of international travelers, and the cozying up to authoritarian regimes across the globe. Yet, despite all of this, I have hope. I have hope because I see the relationships we at SiX are building with state legislators on the ground. I see the seeds of collaboration being planted in state capitals all around the nation. And people are experiencing the ripple effect of these powerful grassroots movements between communities and policymakers. I have hope because I've watched SiX agriculture ally, Representative Sonia Harper of Illinois, organize a hearing with farmers in her community, uplifting their stories and highlighting the severe repercussions of the USDA's removal of funding for critical programs like Illinois Eats and resilient food systems. Representative Harper and her farmer allies are fighting back. Despite the federal chaos, I have hope because SiX reproductive freedom champion, Maryland delegate Leslie Lopez, co-created groundbreaking legislation to establish an abortion funding grant program, meeting a critical need in Maryland as they receive an influx of new patients, many of whom have to travel hundreds of miles for care. Delegate Leslie Lopez is standing in the breach. And I have hope because of SiX democracy defender, Senator Julia Gonzalez. She collaborated with advocates to pass the Colorado Voting Rights Act, a law that will strengthen access to the ballot through expanded protections for LGBTQ voters, voters with disabilities, and those in jail. Senator Gonzalez, she's doing the work of shoring up our democracy. I want to be clear. SiX lawmakers are passing legislation to protect undocumented youth, to shield trans healthcare, and to safeguard voting rights. State legislators are fighting back tooth and nail against harmful legislation nationwide and winning. Even in swing states and conservative strongholds, lawmakers are standing up, speaking out daily, and winning, leading their communities, those most impacted by these harmful authoritarian policies. They're leading them to get involved and to make their voices heard. Nonprofits and local organizations are rising up and standing with legislators at capitals around the country in opposition to regressive and progressive laws and winning. I have watched as our partner legislators have embodied this idea of collaborative governance, a practice that shifts power back to the people, policymakers and communities coming together, co-creating, holding each other accountable, standing together in our shared humanity, charged with safeguarding the vulnerable, preserving our democracy, and creating conditions for all people to thrive. So while this federal government is busy taking a step back and dismantling our government and trampling upon the defenselessness, states are stepping up. States are stepping in to this moment, into this challenge, into this charge to represent and protect all people. State governments in deep relationship with their communities have power and bold solutions to face this moment. And the work that we are doing at SiX in partnership with legislators across the country as a testament to the power of collaborative governments, the power of a people-led movement to change the course of history. And because of that, despite the chaos, there is hope. I'll now turn it over to Iowa Representative Megan Srinivas to share how she's reimagining her role as a co-leader with her fellow Iowans.
Thank you so much, Senator Jackson, for that hope-inspiring speech. And honestly, everything you're saying, I resonate with as you're talking, because it's exactly what I'm seeing on the ground. Across Iowa, across the country, honestly, people are just being left behind because big corporations are taking center stage under this current administration. We're seeing more and more corporations and their profits and personal interests being put ahead of the average American, and in my case, the average Iowan. But in Iowa, we are fighting back to listen, because that hope you talked about, Senator Jackson, that people power, It's present here. The Trump administration is hitting us hard. Right now, as corporate interests are being prioritized over the everyday people that I see, both in my life as a legislator, in my life in the community in Iowa, but also as a physician, which is really the reason I ended up running for office, was because I saw too many of my patients being held back by the systems in place. When I'm seeing this every day, as I get to hear patient stories, I'm seeing Medicaid cuts, preventing them from getting the care that they need. I'm seeing farmers in my rural clinics who are being hit hard by tariffs that have no idea where to turn for any type of support, even their mental health support, as more and more clinics are shutting down. I'm seeing people who used to be able to turn to their rural pharmacies to get access to critical medications. Now, as those pharmacies are shutting down, being left empty-handed, unsure of how they can get access to their vital health needs. And maternal health care is also disappearing in my state. 57% of Iowa counties don't even have a labor and delivery unit anymore. This is a travesty that is worsening every single day. And one of the most recent things that have happened in the last 2 years has been the stats that show that Iowa now has the second highest rate of cancer in the country of any state. And unfortunately, that rate is increasing. We are one of only 2 states that continue to have a rising rate of cancer. But these are things that we can answer if we come together. If we look at a state, as a people, as a community that can come together to say that we need to create policies here at the local level to override the disasters that are being done at the national federal administration. And that's what we've been trying to do. Over the last 2 years, the Bayer Corporation, along with several other pesticide companies, have tried to push a bill in Iowa, as well as a few other states. It started here in Iowa last year, as well as Missouri and Idaho in 2024. They thought of us as the prelim ground. I was directly told by one lobbyist that if they could get it through Iowa, then they could get it everywhere in the United States. And it was a bill that would have given complete liability immunity to these pesticide companies for any of the negative effects that would happen, health or economic. We fought back last year and stopped that. And this year, we did a series of listening posts throughout the state. Every single legislator that I spoke to wasn't sure initially where they were going to stand. But I knew we had the power to be able to use people's voice in Iowa to make sure they understood the stories that were affected every single day by the decisions that were going to be impacted by this policy. We did listening posts because we decided we needed to go to the people. Lobbyists get easy access to us up at the Capitol. That happens in every single capital, state or federal. They are there to represent entities, and sometimes they can be very helpful, and sometimes it gives an unfair advantage to the people who can afford to have a lobbyist. But the average Iowan, the average American, they can't afford to pay somebody to represent them in their interests. They can't afford to have somebody at the Capitol making sure that they can still afford food every single day for their family, or that they can continue to survive if they're facing cancer. And that's why we needed to do these listening posts. So I worked with different communities. Originally, we planned to do 1 in each corner of Iowa, so 4 different listening posts. And at every single one, I wanted a lawmaker from the other side of the aisle to be present, because cancer is not a partisan issue. After the first one, which we did in a very conservative corner, northwest corner of the state, in Spencer, Iowa, we had an overwhelming response. One person stood in front of me, told me he had never voted for a Democrat in his life. He was hesitant to show up, but the minute he heard cancer, he knew for the memory of his wife who had died of cancer, for his son who was currently suffering from cancer, for his daughter-in-law who was currently in remission from breast cancer, that he had to show up and share his story and share his concerns. And it was voices like his that showed up in one location after another, who have reached out to me, turned what was supposed to be 4 listening posts into now a long list that's going to go at least through the fall of 10 listening posts or more. It's those voices that banded together to come up with solutions that many of us hadn't even thought of or even realized were important ways to address this issue. But moreover, it was those voices that came together and wrote into their legislators, told their Iowa representatives and senators that they needed to stand up against corporate interests, that they needed to stand for Iowans and for Iowans' healthcare. And because of that, this bill died in an overwhelming way this year. So despite what's happening at the federal level, I too have so much hope because Iowans' voices matter. The individual in rural Iowa, in Northwest Iowa, Spencer, that farmer I saw in Jefferson, Iowa, the farmer I saw in Charles City, Iowa, the small town teacher I saw in Atlantic, those voices matter. And they're stopping some really deleterious things that could have happened and instead using their voices to create the positive change we need. And that's why I know, despite what we're seeing at the federal level, this future ahead of us is bright. That we're going to band together in my state in Iowa, and honestly, Americans in rural spaces throughout the country, to make sure we fight for our communities and get us back on track to where we need to be. So I am excited to pass this on to Senator Noelle Frame, who will talk about why she too has hope in her state of Washington. Thank you all.
Well, thank you so much, Representative, and thank you for everyone who is here with us today. Again, I'm Noelle Frame, State Senator from the 36th District, which is a portion of the city of Seattle. I want to talk a little bit today about the fight that we've had out in Washington State for many years, but it really came to a fore this year, and that is on our tax code. I think there's been a lot of coverage of the federal tax fight on the reauthorization of the Trump tax cuts from 2017. And frankly, the same fight that's happening at the federal level is happening in many places across the state, the country, and certainly in my Washington state. As you know, states are being asked to take on more and more with the Trump administration. They're trying to decentralize government and push that responsibility out to states where we are more reliant on regressive taxes than the federal government. And it's not the secret at all there that if you push out services to states that are relying on regressive taxes, it doesn't cost rich people and large corporations that much to do it. So it's in their interest to do exactly that. And so as we came into our session with a very large budget deficit, we had to ask ourselves some really hard questions about how we were going to solve that crisis. Specifically, we budget in a 4-year cycle, and we had a $16 billion deficit over that 4-year, or approximately $4 billion a year. We were looking at increased costs because of inflation. I will tell you, there was one day in the legislative session where literally overnight, our budget problem got $1 billion worse because of the craziness of the market fueled by the catastrophic decisions of the Trump administration. And that immediately translated to increased costs for our state. We have increased caseloads. Frankly, we have tremendous wealth and income inequality in our state. We have some of the largest corporations and wealthiest individuals in the world that call our state home, and people that are holding on by a thread and are utilizing the services that we have put forward, like access to early learning, long-term care, services for our neighbors with disabilities, and more. And I will say in particular, our K-12 schools are tremendously strained, not only because of inflation, but frankly, because of all the aftermath of COVID, and our kids are really challenged and suffering and really trying to catch up from the COVID era. So as I came into the session, I was part of our budget team in the state Senate and really focused on how we could protect all of those services, particularly as we think about the federal government's role. Federal funds make up about 28% of our budget. I just mentioned education. We depend on funds under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, under Title I for our schools with the majority of kids in poverty. So it was really important for us to keep all that in mind. And I will say at the end of all of this, we just got out of session the night before last, and we ended with $2.3 billion in reserves at the end of the 25-27 cycle, and another $3.6 billion after the end of the 4-year cycle. Because we really need to protect ourselves against the decisions that are being made by the Trump administration. As we sought to solve that budget crisis, something that we put forward is an idea that I and others in Washington State have been working on for at least the last 5 years, which is a tax on wealth, and specifically a tax on financial assets, stocks, bonds, exchange-traded funds, and mutual funds. Frankly, we have a lot of people in Washington State, 4,300 people specifically, that have more than $50 million of assets, and that's how the tax was structured, a 1% tax on assets in excess of $50 million. There was quite a journey of that proposal over the session. Our outgoing governor proposed it to bridge that budget gap. It was a cornerstone of the budgets from the House and the Senate. Our new governor took it off the table as a major funding source, although left the door open to a smaller version of that. Sadly, outside forces led by Microsoft, quite literally the largest corporation in the world, fought vigorously with open threats, multiple millions of dollars into a lobbying campaign to kill even a small version of that bill. And ultimately, it came off the table as a budget funding source, as well as even a test case. But 2 nights ago, my colleagues in the state Senate said, we're voting for it anyway. And we voted it off the Senate floor in what some would portray as a symbolic vote. But what I will say is we are in the first session of a 2-year biennium. That means that that bill is sitting in our Rules Committee ready to go. And we showed the strength of support that we have in the state Senate. The Speaker of the House was also quoted as saying there is tremendous support for that proposal in the House of Representatives. And so we are ready to go. What I was left with instead to solve that budget crisis was a little bit relying on existing revenue sources, having to increase taxes, base rate taxes on our businesses. We haven't done that since the 80s or 90s, but it is what it is. We did have some wins in terms of modernizing our sales tax, asking some of our largest corporations to do a bit more, and raising our capital gains tax and estate tax to be a bit more progressive. And ultimately, we're able to put over $1 billion of new investments in our schools, again, thinking really clearly about the threats from the federal government, trying to dismantle the Department of Education and take away those funding sources. So it was a bit of a journey this session, but we have got momentum in Washington State, and we think that we have done as good of a job as anybody could with a $16 billion deficit to protect our communities, protect our kids in our schools, and hedge against additional threats from the Trump administration. With that, I'm going to wrap up my time, and I will hand it over to Representative Sylvia Ortiz-Velas.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm State Representative Ortiz-Velas. I represent the only Voting Rights Act district for Latinos in Wisconsin. 70% of my population is Latino, where I was born and raised. So you can imagine my community and communities all across Wisconsin and all across the state country are going through a lot when it comes to immigration and the unjust, unlawful positions that it has put all elected officials in, quite frankly, including our judges in Milwaukee County. I am the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee here in the state of Wisconsin. And just like many other people, I am appalled by the complete attack on our Constitution by the federal government and their overreach. And especially their inability to adhere to the principles of separation of powers, illegal searches and seizures as well. Early on in session, when we started to see some of the very unsettling orders that have come out of the White House, Wisconsin Democrats actually created a bill. We have a bill, which is AB 57, that would prevent federal government overreach. And it would apply to all government spaces, because we were very early on concerned that as a state, we would not be able to fulfill our constitutional duties to provide services equally to all of our residents, because our Constitution charges us with that duty. So we also make sure, again, that the bill applies to government spaces, as well as schools, churches, daycare centers, and medical facilities. And it would require that no official or employee agent of the state agency or other body from local government may aid in the detention of an individual based on them solely being here unlawfully. I mean, unless they have a judicial warrant. So without a judicial warrant, we made it very clear that no government agency. And the reason we made it broad enough to include any government agency federal government agencies, because there was early on, the president had deputized many different agencies to perform ICE operations. In Wisconsin, again, we created AB 57 for various reasons, and now, quite prophetically, if we would have had something like that in place, I feel like we would have had a lot better ways to deal with this. And certainly when we drafted the law, we balanced anti-commandeering laws with supremacy. So we did a nice balance, and we believe it's constitutional. So we believe it's something we can pass here in our state. And in our state of Wisconsin, I feel like, times are bad, but I feel we're blessed in many ways. We have a governor, Tony Evers, who will veto any bad bills because of fair maps. We have a much better situation when it comes to fairness and representation in the House. I think next session we could certainly capture the Senate. So we at most have split government, and just recently with Supreme Court Judge Susan Crawford, soon to be, she hasn't been sworn in yet. We will have a fair and balanced. We will continue to have a fair and balanced Supreme Court for at least 3 years. So in that way, we're trying to mainly deal with what's going on out of the Trump administration. And again, when it comes to Hannah Dugan, and I happen to know Hannah Dugan, I've known her for years. She's one of the nicest people you can ever meet. And I'm certain that she was following the law. And in these trying times, I think people need to keep some things in perspective that people are not thinking about and people are not asking. And I'm hoping to get this message across here today as well. We're hoping that that she's found, found, not guilty. Basically, we need the federal government to allow us to do our job as a state. We have more than just court services in our county court buildings, and it creates quite frankly, a constitutional issue for our state. When it comes to delivering services, and also it's creating a situation in our state where it's making it difficult for us to ensure due process and the proper administration of justice for everyone. So they're making it hard for us to kind of perform our duties by creating a place of distrust and confusion and a chaos and lawlessness in our courts. Quite frankly, what I think people need to keep in mind that most people aren't thinking about, and I think it's kind of getting lost out there because there's so much going on. But I want people to think about those photos of people in CCOT. And I want people to ask questions, because somebody mentioned to me one day, deportation ends when people are removed. So why are we detaining them? If the purpose is removal, then why we as taxpayers paying money for detention of people indefinitely with no court dates, no bail? 75 to 90% of them have no criminal record. We have no guarantees of their conditions, no promises against cruel and unusual punishment, indefinitely with no charges and no due process. Wouldn't it be cheaper to let them go? They're no longer in our country. I don't understand why we're still holding them in detention. When I look at the people that they have, I see that most of them, I'm sorry, my video started. Most of the people that they have, if you look at the CCOT photos, they're young men between the ages of 20, 45. And they're not overweight, they're healthy. And that's, I think, odd, because 40% of Americans are overweight. And in some parts of the world, it's 50%. So I think it's kind of strange to find that many people that are coming from here that are not overweight. I feel it's intentional. And I feel that there are other nefarious things that are happening, things of human tragedies that we're going to find out about later. So when I think about what Hannah Dugan did, whether or not there was a judicial warrant, which there was not, and all she did was ask them to follow the law, which is what we're asking them to do as well in AB 57. We're asking them to honor our Constitution and not commit illegal searches and seizures. When I think about the people that are in CCAT. We have to stop calling it deportations. These are not deportations. These are people being kidnapped and sent into human trafficking, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, organ trafficking. And I'm going to continue to show the photos and the pictures of the people in CCAT whenever I can, because I want people to see that people could be sent to their deaths, and that very well, we don't know what's going on there. It keeps me up at night. But I do have hope, because as a state, we know that we're going to have to stick together in the end. When the cuts come down as a budget for our state, we're going to do the prioritizing. That's what we need to work on to try to, if people were around for COVID-19, I'm in my 3rd term. The mission's the same. Save as many people as we can. Thank you.
Thank you to all our speakers. We will now open up for questions. Again, you can add a question to the chat, or if you raise your hand, you can come off mute and ask your question out loud. We'll start with a question from Adam, who is curious about the panelists' views on the impacts of how and where conservative state legislatures have attempted to mimic the Trump administration on the state level. So he gives the example of 20 examples of state level DOJ type committees. What are the risks of these state level efforts, and how are progressives responding to this? I will pass it to Senator Jackson to start us off on a response on what's happening in Georgia.
Yeah, thanks, Emmy, and thanks, Adam, for your question. So Georgia had a DOJ bill that did not pass this session, but it was introduced, and what it was akin to was basically trying to grind all of our state agencies to a screeching halt by forcing them to have to redo their rules every 3 years. The rules making process in Georgia is actually quite complex. It requires a number of public hearings, and agencies that have been around for a long time have hundreds of rules. And so the idea of having to redo all the rules every 3 years and starting from scratch it will ultimately drive our agencies wild and not make them effective. So what progressive legislators did, people like me and many others, is we brought the people out to talk about the ineffectiveness of our agencies currently and what we saw as the need to fix them. And it wasn't about rules changes. It was about some basic things like hiring enough people to actually answer the phones and to do the work. We really brought out, I think, a strong number of just regular people who have struggled to get the Department of Labor, Department of Family and Children Services, just these kind of basic agencies, could not just get them to answer the phone or respond to an email. That's not a rule problem. That's a people power problem in terms of having enough people. And so we were able to fight that back. I think we'll continue to fight that back because there's just enough Georgians right now today who are really dependent upon agencies working effectively, and pulling them back in terms of the ways that they're trying to do it does not help Georgians. And so Georgians, I think, are clear about that, and they were able to make their voices known to legislators.
Thank you for that. And Megan or Sylvia, would you like to weigh in on how you're seeing this in your states?
Sure. So Iowa actually was one of the first to kind of approach this unfortunate trend. And actually in 2023 is when we introduced, and I say we, it was really our governor and the majority party who introduced a bill that they called the realignment. But in reality, it was a complete reorganization that cut half our departments, put a lot of essential committees, either they disappeared or they put them under HHS or some other departments that basically were trying to condense their power. So we actually saw, for instance, when it came to our licensing boards, that's a perfect example. We used to have a licensing board for medicine, for dental, for nursing, all of these different specialties that are really integral to ensuring that people are getting adequate care and that it's being done with the proper oversight. They took all of the executive directors of those boards and turned it into one executive director that became powerless, and really put it in the hands of the appointee, who's the director of Dial. So Director Johnson, who has no actual information or background in these specific genres. And so for him to have the power now to reduce that oversight that we're having, that is actually very dangerous to health outcomes in Iowa. And we're seeing a lot of pushback from the different industries themselves who are concerned about some of the lax rules and regulations that are happening around that. But we've seen that in a number of fields. We saw that with some of our union workers and some of the apprenticeship programs. We saw that also happen with our fire marshals. Actually, they were all condensed and put into a different department as well, away from their typical work. Many who ended up actually leaving because they were threatened to lose their retirement benefits if they did not choose to step down at that time. So we've seen this happen over and over again. Our HHS right now is actually overrun because half of the departments were really put under their purview, the items that actually maintained. And in that setting, we're seeing delay of services. And unfortunately, a lot of constituents being worried about where they're going to be able to get their Medicaid coverage, or especially for people with disabilities, seeing a lot of those services being delayed, even though they're critical in a timely manner. After that, when DOGE appeared, we have now since had our governor create a specific DOGE committee within Iowa, which has contributed to lack of transparency around these changes because it was done through executive order. So we are definitely seeing some concerns around all of this, and an exacerbation of already the deleterious effects that happened under what was really a reorganization of our entire government that was done in a very fast and in a behind closed doors fashion. And we are protesting it. We fought hard against it in 2023 and again in 2024 when they were trying to do some cleanup after that, and they're continuing to try to do some cleanup. And we are being very vociferous in our protests, and it's becoming more and more apparent, especially as we highlight individuals and their stories that they're bringing to light as to how they're being individually impacted. And that is creating a lot of pushback within public space. So I have hope for further pushback, being able to hopefully slow some of these things from happening.
So in Wisconsin, we have been trying to claw back for more than 50 years from the Walker Republican had all the switches era. And we've been doing pretty good. We're going in the right direction. So I know people mentioned about rules and how important we're all lawmakers. Rules are the most important. So when it comes to rules in Wisconsin, we're actually we're going in the right direction. So we have a case called Evers versus Merklin, which challenges the way our rules committee functions, which is basically as super legislators. And it's funny because they have my button even in that room, which I didn't authorize. So they act as super legislators, challenging any rule the governor can take. Our Supreme Court has ruled on half of that, and they've ruled in favor of the governor on joint finance. So when it comes to things that we've already done in the budget, guess what? They're already done in the budget. You don't get to relitigate that in another super legislator committee. There's some abuse of powers and separation of powers issues going on. So that's really getting cleaned up. We're waiting on the final ruling for our rules committee. So we're hoping that will be a favorable ruling as well. So we'll be able to kind of do a lot more maneuvering that we've been doing in the past. And so we're again lucky to have Governor Tony Evers to make sure that he's taking care of everybody in our state. When it comes to like some of the things that we've seen at the national level and like the things that are coming out of the White House and the things that they're doing in Wisconsin, they created a DOGE committee. No surprise. They mainly are harping on return back to work for employees out of state, for state employees and so forth. In-person work is mainly their main kick that they have in that committee right now. When it comes to just like the general same old theme, they have their trans bills, which, there is basically, it's just a messaging day for them because they don't have the numbers to get it into law. So it's just like, it's a day of nothingness for us. We do our messaging, they do their messaging. We have our sound bites, they get their sound bites, and it goes nowhere. day of waste for taxpayers. We're almost done through that. We've gone through the trans bills. We had a series of those. We went through the anti-crime bills, the anti-immigrant bills. And so it's basically all the same themes, but and now I feel like we're finally getting to a point where you might get to business, and which is really odd place to really be to negotiate. I actually author and do a lot of bipartisan work actually in the building. I'm one of the biggest people that move a lot. I move a lot of the bills in that building. I think last session I authored 10% of the bills the governor signed into law in my state, 1 out of 99. So I work. It's a weird place to be because our focus really has not been fighting with the Republicans in our state because we're going to have to deal with them, right? But it's really been just punching at the federal. But we know that every time we hit Donald Trump, we hit them too. And so we're going to keep on working. And we're bringing people together. I've been doing more town halls now than I've ever done, I think. And I think the other thing I want to say, in Wisconsin at least, Republicans are been really quiet. So they're really they're coming to grinding things to a halt. Basically, I don't know how much work we're going to get done in our house this year. I mean, we'll see. There are problems that we need to fix, and we don't have a choice, so we'll have to deal with them. But I think it's rather interesting, the dynamics, because we might have to budget twice even. So it's just everything's really kind of off, and I don't know if people really know kind of what to do in Wisconsin yet, and how to interact. But we have split government, so nobody has control of anything. So I know in other states it's different, but we've been clawing our way back. So it hasn't been always like that for us. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a note from Joe about new reporting on their wealth tax in Massachusetts, and Senator Frame, I think you have some input on this.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, thanks, Joe, for highlighting that. And yeah, I mean, the recent research out of Massachusetts follows research that we're seeing in a lot of different places. I had an opportunity to meet Cristobal Young, a professor out of Stanford, pre-pandemic actually, and his book, The Myth of Millionaire Flight, talks about exactly this. While there is always high-profile moves, they are anecdotal and they are not illustrative of what the broader trends are. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities has also done research on this. Frankly, unfortunately, actually where we're seeing migration is the middle and working class who can't afford to stay in the places that they want to live because cost of living has gone up so much. What we're not seeing at any degree of statistical significance is the movement in migration of millionaires and billionaires. What we actually see is, rather than people up and moving, some degree of tax avoidance behavior. And it's why it's really important when we design tax policy that we design it in a way that holds people accountable for paying taxes to the places from which they have grown their wealth. That wealthy individuals, frankly, large corporations, grow their wealth based on the shared community investments that we have made with our taxes. And the idea that somebody would up and leave the moment we ask them to pay more, frankly, if they do that, I mean, the word selfish comes to mind, I just have to say. But generally speaking, that's not what the evidence tells us. It tells us that they're not moving because they can afford it. They can pay it. What I proposed was a 1% tax, 1%, $10 on every $1,000 of assessed value. This is insignificant to people that have that degree of wealth. They can pay it. They should pay it because it's the investments that we have all made that they have benefited from. And frankly, when we look at financial assets in particular, financial assets are the drivers of modern wealth and the drivers of modern inequality. It's not real estate anymore. All the states across the country, we all tax real estate, but we're not taxing the ownership of financial assets. That's a major loophole in every state tax code in the country, and we got to do something about it, which is why Washington State has been very proud to be on the leading edge of this and pushing as hard as we can, and sharing our lessons and our learnings with other states that we are organizing with through the Tax Justice Initiative with the State Innovation Exchange, because it is time. And the big stories don't match the actual data.
Thank you so much for that. We have a lot of rich links being dropped in the chat now. And as a reminder, this is being recorded. I'll share this recording out and a lot of these links that have been shared later. Just wanted to pause and see if we have any final questions from reporters. Okay, Joe, I am going to take you off mute.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? First of all, thank you for doing this. This is amazing. I host a show on SiriusXM Progress called State of the States, where I talk to state legislators every week because, that's where the action is. One of the things I'm always intrigued by is you all are so much closer to your constituents and members of Congress, that you see them in the grocery store, you knock doors, you actually do it, you communicate in different ways and much closer. I'm interested in, what are you hearing most? What are the biggest concerns, and have those changed over the past few months? I know it's a question, Representative Ortiz-Villa, as you mentioned, having town halls. I'm just kind of interested in what is the vibe from your constituents?
Generally speaking, people are looking for hope. People are looking for somewhere to express their concerns. And, I try to remind people that, hey, we got through COVID together. We're going to get through this together too. We have to start thinking about what it is we can do. So how do we empower ourselves? How do we prepare ourselves? So we have a plan, and that we're not caught off guard. A lot of the things that people are also concerned about, obviously, is cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. I have a lot of people in my community that are going to be affected by that. When I can tell you this, when it comes to budgets, and when I see requests for $9 million for war memorials and coming out of the Republican side, I laugh. I laugh when I think about the two men that were in my office begging to make sure that I cover the people that are going to take care of them. And I will, and I definitely will. And I assure them of that. And I think people just want comfort. For my state, I can give them hope because I can tell them, hey, we got a governor, that's not going to sign a bad bill. We have, Democrats in the House that are ready and waiting. I think what's great in our state is, again, the Republicans aren't saying anything. So all they see is the Democrats out there fighting for them. And they're going to remember that later on. So I feel like we're getting traction. We're going into Republican districts in areas, and we're doing town halls. We're talking to people. Constituent time, we're done with the Supreme Court. I don't want to, confuse people. So people are going to be doing constituent doors all summer long. We're going to be talking to the people. I mean, taking it to the people door by door. That's where we connect. And the people, they don't have time to go to meetings, and we have to come to them. So I'm making sure that I'm going to go and talk to the people. I go to events. I try to make myself accessible. But more than anything, I think just assuring people, the main things that I'm hearing are the cuts that people are worried about. And what we can do in our budgets, again, we had a $4 billion surplus to start with. So we have a $4 billion surplus in our state. But that's only because last session, we didn't let them give the money away to the rich. So,
Joe, I'll just add really quickly. My district abuts the CDC. And so I have a significant number of constituents who work or worked past tense, many now who worked past tense at the CDC. And so I'm hearing from constituents who are just very worried about their livelihood, about not just their livelihood in terms of money that they make, right, but in terms of our livelihood collectively, because many of them were working on really important disease prevention work, right? So I'm hearing, I think, some despair and some real sense of desperateness of like, how do we move forward together? How do we keep each other safe? And then, I am also hearing just a significant amount of frustration from people who don't understand what state legislators do. Like, just quite frankly, I get calls complaining about what's not happening in Congress because people don't understand how our democracy is formed and shaped. So I get misplaced, what I think of as misplaced anger, and I'm always happy to forward their emails and their nasty voicemails to my colleagues who live in Washington, D.C. or work in Washington, D.C.
I'll jump in here and say that I think people are scared, but I also think people are standing in solidarity. And I've seen that play out really, and particularly in Washington State. We have the ICE Detention Center here in Washington State in Tacoma. And we have had several folks picked up that are not strangers to our communities. These are people that we know are high profile. We had Llewellyn Dixon, who has been in the United States for 50 years and is a lab worker at the University of Washington Medical Center, was picked up when she was coming back from visiting her family in the Philippines for a drug offense some decades ago that had never been an issue. And she was thrown in the detention center. We had Lilo Juarez Zeffirino, who has been an active young person since he was a teenager with the farm worker movement in Skagit County, and with a group called Community to Community that is very active in the community. He was picked up and thrown in the detention center. And we have seen protests at the detention center. We just passed legislation really empowering our Department of Health to have inspection authority so that we can make sure that people have basic human needs met when they are in these facilities. And I'm seeing a lot of folks that look like me who are scared, but recognize that they are not the ones who are the most vulnerable and are standing in solidarity, particularly with our immigrants that are being picked up and detained. We had our first week of the legislature. One of my colleagues in the state Senate mentioned the fear that they had that one of the parents of one of the kids on the soccer team that he coaches was going to get picked up, and lo and behold, it happened during session. So people are really scared, but people are standing in solidarity with their neighbors, which is beautiful, but we shouldn't have to do this. We shouldn't have to.
And I'll add on, and there's several things that I'm hearing, both I live currently and I represent a very diverse area that has a lot of refugees, a lot of immigrants, and we're seeing our refugees, many of whom, if they were sent back home, it would be an automatic death sentence. I mean, these are people who came from Afghanistan after helping the US Army. And we owe them. They saved our soldiers' lives, and we owe them. And we brought them here. We've got a few thousand who now are suddenly being cut off from any form of funding, from any form of support, and being threatened. Many even have gotten emails that they are going to be deported, even though they were given the promise that if they helped our military survive, that they would be protected. We're seeing worries around that. We're seeing farmers who are really concerned that right now the direction between the tariffs and unfortunately the decline in prices for crops, really the negative atmosphere that surrounds small farms and the inability for them to really persist. We're seeing many farmers being concerned that this is reminiscent of the 1980s farm crisis right before it started and where we could potentially be heading. So the economic instability around that. And honestly, in a place like Iowa, when we see our ag economy being impacted or even scared about the impending impacts, we see that affect our entire state and the economic health of our entire state. We're also seeing people just terrified about healthcare, both from an accessibility and availability standpoint. Unfortunately, we have had a decline in the number of resources available. We're dead last when it comes to per capita mental health resources. We are dead last when it comes to OB-GYN and maternal health resources on a per capita basis, amongst so many other areas in which we are in a massive decline. So even from an availability standpoint, there's an issue. But then especially when we're looking at our smaller towns and rural communities, and even honestly in our bigger cities, if you get diagnosed with cancer or see a lump in your breast, having to wait 4 or 5 months to see a specialist could make the difference between a stage 1 diagnosis and a stage 4, life and death. And we're seeing people who, even if they can get in, how do they afford that healthcare, especially with Medicaid and Medicare cuts? happening left and right. Those are the things really bonding people together, because they see that they all are suffering together as a community. And they didn't realize that that was going to happen. But the fact that they are bonding together over that creates an ability to push back and create positive change. And that's what we're moving towards.
Thank you so much. With that, we are going to wrap today's press call. If you have any additional questions or follow-up, please feel free to reach out to me. And thank you again so much to our panelists for lending your experiences and expertise and sharing what is happening in your states in these first 100 days. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for all y'all do. Take care.
Thank you for everybody sharing, touching. Very touching. Thank you.